Hi, I'm Amzie Winning. The motto for Bourbon on the Banks Festival is Sip Bourbon and Savor History. So far on Undressing Bourbon, we've done several episodes about sipping bourbon, so today we're going to savor a little bit of history. We're going to join Dave Sandlin here at House of Commons in downtown Frankfort, who's going to tell us a little bit about the history of distilling in Frankfort. Come on in. Well, Dave, thank you very much for joining us today on this episode of Undressing Bourbon. To get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about the story of House of Commons?
I would love to, Amzie. Thank you for having me. I grew up East Tennessee, close to the Smoky Mountains, but my mom was from Frankfort, and my wife and I relocated here about 2 years ago. Although I already loved bourbon when I moved to the area, I learned upon moving here that my great-grandmother was actually born at the OFC distillery. So learning information like that ignited this passion for bourbon history, because I immediately said, I've got to learn more. I've got to learn more about my lineage and learn more about the historical distilleries, which, living in Frankfort made it pretty easy. Because it really feels like bourbon history is on every corner here in downtown Frankfort. And honestly, Amzie, I just learned a little under a year ago that the house that we moved into, that it was built for the master distiller at Hermitage Distillery in 1888. So opening a bar in downtown Frankfort with a high emphasis on the history of bourbon and vintage bottles just seemed like a natural fit. And so we were blessed to find this location.
Could you explain to me a little bit your process of building flights of bourbon here at the bar? Does the history take part in that at all?
Absolutely it does. I always say that a flight needs a thread. So it could be the history of the time that the bourbon spends in the barrel. It could be educating and helping people to understand the role that proof plays on the product. But my favorite ones to tell are the history behind the distilleries, the distiller, or sometimes the personalities that the bourbons are named after. Anytime we can have a thread where we can educate and tell a story behind the bourbon, that's where it really becomes a lot of fun.
Sometimes it is history as that thread. Is it sometimes a thread based on a brand or a mash bill or something like that?
Absolutely. So we do have times where it's the age and the proof, could be the story, it could be the mash bill. We go through the family of the mash bill within that distillery, different expressions based off of that mash bill, or it could be a mash bill across multiple distilleries. It could be a thread of wheated bourbons, or it could be a thread of rye. The ultimate goal is to show people products that maybe they weren't familiar with before, or help them to learn something new about Kentucky bourbon that they didn't know before.
So I see that the collection of bottles here you have is really impressive, and also the vintage bottles that you have. Is there something that you look for when you are curating bottles here at House of Commons?
We are absolutely looking for a multitude of things when we're curating bottles to offer our guests. One we may be looking to offer is product that has come out of a distillery that's shuttered. It could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to taste that product because they're not producing anymore. One thing I like to try and curate is product across different producers. Some of these labels or these namesakes of these bourbon have changed hands over time, and sometimes that means that the mash bill changes as well, but allowing someone to taste a product like Eagle Rare or Benchmark over the years, and just to have a point of reference against what the product has become over time. And sometimes it's the same product from a heritage distiller that maybe the mash bill itself has remained consistent, but the master distiller has changed over time, or the environmental factors have changed over time. And a great example of that is a vintage maker's mark. And being able to provide individuals the opportunity to tailor a tasting experience where they can compare a vintage product against today's product oftentimes allows and affords people the opportunity to learn what history is in the bottle and how things were done differently and what similarities there are today. But it's always a fun discovery for people to walk through that bourbon journey.
So as far as something like that Maker's Mark example, and how it has changed over time, if it's been Maker's Mark, it's been distilled at the same place, what could explain a change over time, and what might some of those changes be in the flavor profiles?
That's a great question, Amesy. So all factors that go into the making of bourbon, from your water source to the wood that's used in the barrels, to the yeast, the distillation process itself, impact and impart flavors on the product. Now, master distillers change, that's obviously going to make some changes. If you are in a place where you have to change rick houses, the environmental factors are going to play a huge role. But the most notable change that we encounter when you're looking at a vintage bottle versus a current release is the wood that was used and the maturation of the product. Those are the two that are most readily making changes in the product, as well as possibly the grain. And Makers is a great situation because they have remained and they have ensured consistency across product for years in their sourcing of the grain, as well as where they place their product.
Yeah, thank you. That's really informative. I think sometimes we don't think about those changes over time. When coming into a place like House of Commons, what should a customer be aware of as far as maybe pricing, availability, etc.?
Our availability will change. We absolutely have core products that we want to represent because our heart is to represent every Kentucky distillery. And so there are core items that you can expect to be here. You can expect there to be at least one expression from every Kentucky distillery. But with that being said, like I said, we always have something that checks a box for every person that could walk through the door. One thing that is that's huge priority to me is that we offer half-ounce pours. And the reason I had the passion to offer half-ounce pours was to help lower the hurdle and lower the entry requirements for people to get into various types of bourbon, especially vintage bourbon. You know, I would go to these places and I would be very interested in a product, and it would be $70 for an ounce and a half pour. And I was like, I'm either not interested or wasn't able to. And it was very important to me that here we offer pours that were within reach and that we afford people the opportunity to try multiple things.
Yeah, that's great. There's, I don't know, nothing more heartbreaking than you see this bottle you've always wanted to try, you know, on the shelf, and then you ask the price and it's way too much. So I think that's great.
And it's just out of reach.
Right.
You know, just out of reach. And that's the goal, is that we want to make Kentucky bourbon within reach for people.
So with some of the vintage spirits too, you know, one thing I think of is, you know, when I was young, and my grandfather, he either drank Yellowstone or Early Times. And so you probably get some people too that the vintage bottle, there's just, you know, there's this nostalgia, there's this special reason they want to try some of it. And so to make that available for people, I think that's a very nice thing.
And MZ, I got to tell you that that's one of the greatest honors of what we do here. You know, it was just about a week and a half ago, I had some guests come in and they spotted my AAA 10-year and they said, I want to pour that. And, as they're drinking it, I'm watching them go down memory lane. And then someone else comes in and they see the bottle out on the counter and they want to pour that. And I'm watching 3 people connect with memories and emotions and community that they had spent drinking that bottle years ago. And it's such an honor. It really feels like a special feeling to be able to be in the presence of people that can connect in community over that way. Whether it's a new pour that they're just discovering, or whether it's an old favorite that they're connecting with fond memories, is just really special.
So you talked a little bit about your family history with distilling here in Frankfort. Were there any other reasons why you chose Frankfort as the location for House of Commons?
Absolutely. Frankfort is bourbon history. It doesn't matter where you look in Frankfort, you find bourbon history. I like to say Frankfort has a history with bourbon, just because I walk down the street and I see the house that E.H. Taylor lived in. You look at the housing market and you see houses that master distillers once occupied. I drive past Old Grandad Distillery or I drive past Old Crow Distillery on my way to work, and it doesn't matter where you turn in Frankfort. Bourbon history is everywhere, and there's hundreds of thousands of people that visit Frankfort every year for the good work that our current distilleries and master distillers are putting out. But at the end of the day, Frankfort has a story to tell. And if you look for it, you're going to see exactly what Frankfort has been putting out for over 200 years. Frankfort's home to bourbon royalty. And whether it's Old Grandad, Old Crow, Old Taylor, or Ancient Age, these are some of the products on our shelves that when individuals come in that they get the most excited about. It's the product that your dad or grandfather would drink. It's the product that you've heard legends of and that are highly sought after. And they are for a reason, because Frankfort has history of putting out quality bourbon for generations. And that's why I'm drawn to Frankfort. And I love the opportunity to send the message of Frankfort bourbon and the history that Frankfort plays in Kentucky bourbon. Largely what we're looking at is Frankfort in tourism. The reality is it's called Central Kentucky for a reason. And bourbon runs all throughout the veins of Kentucky. So the fact that we are in a unique location, being in the heart of Central Kentucky, allows us the opportunity to point people in all directions to discover Kentucky bourbon. We're not trying to just keep people here, even though I do love Frankfort bourbon. There's great bourbon all throughout the state. And, we even have a sign right outside the door that has lists of all Kentucky distilleries and how far they are from here. And it just really helps put a visual to the proximity that Frankfort has to Kentucky bourbon. So it allows us to have a pulse on all Kentucky bourbon being produced throughout the state, because we are in the heart of bourbon country. The bourbon community is a special community, and it is oftentimes like a family more than it is people unified behind a common love of a beverage. But I feel personally this responsibility to educate people on what has made Kentucky bourbon what it is today and what continues to make it so special, because I want people to understand. I don't want to see some of the distilleries of today shudder like they did 40 years ago because I didn't do my part to educate our guests.
Dave, thank you very much for joining us today. I think that was very informative. You shared so much information with us. I certainly will be coming back in here frequently, trying some of these vintage bourbons. And thank you for joining us. On behalf of everyone here at Undressing Bourbon and Bourbon on the Banks Festival, we hope you enjoyed this episode and found it informative. Be sure to check us out on social media. Cheers.
Because we are in the heart of bourbon country.
That's strong. That's strong.